In 1978, George A. Romero released Dawn of the Dead, the film that not only expanded the zombie genre, but also offered a biting critique of society's obsession with consumerism. With most of the film taking place in a shopping mall, it explores themes of isolation, materialism, and societal collapse, all while delivering one of the most iconic zombie experiences in cinematic history. But beyond the horror, one of the most interesting pieces of the film is the way both society and the government responds to the coming apocalypse. During the course of Dawn of the Dead, you will see how the government clings on to its power and tries to fight off the hordes of the undead. During this, we see a unique blend of real National Guardsmen who volunteered to be in the film and actors portraying Guardsmen, creating a fascinating mix of uniforms and equipment. This is the part we will be focusing on today, so join me as we take a look at Dawn of the Dead on Studio Surplus. Hello and happy Halloween. I'm Jake, and today we're diving into the legendary film Dawn of the Dead. Now, some argue it's superior to its predecessor, Night of the Living Dead, and while I love both films, I'll admit Dawn has a slight edge for me. I could gush about this movie for hours, but let's focus on our main topic. So, what is Studio Surplus? I wanted the opportunity to talk about military surplus and all of my favorite media, whether it be movies, games, shows, or whatever. While I know analyzing military gear in this way isn't a groundbreaking concept, there's many YouTubers that do it already, I was hoping I could bring my own unique flair to the table. The idea has been brewing longer than my YouTube channel itself, and I've been itching to cover the surplus in this movie since the early planning stages of my channel. As I mentioned earlier, what makes Dawn unique is the mix of gear and uniforms worn by both the real National Guardsmen and the actors portraying soldiers. I realize that the police, including both Roger and Peter, are wearing some military surplus, but I wanted to focus on just the National Guard here. However, Collector Nick already has a great video detailing all the gear worn by them and the police in the movie. Let's start by examining the uniforms and equipment used by the actors portraying Guardsmen in two key scenes, the apartment raid and the redneck party scene. Okay, so I have Ken here set up as one of the actors portraying National Guardsmen in both the apartment raid scene and the redneck party scene. Now, the basic layout of this kit is pretty simple. There's actually not much to it, but we'll go from head down and just discuss all the things that he's wearing, what they were wearing. Now, starting from the head, we're going to look at the helmet. Now, they're wearing M1 helmet liners and not full M1 helmets with the steel pot. Now, you can kind of tell pretty quickly when you're watching the movie that they're not wearing a steel pot because they have no harness connection point at all. There's no swivel bail. You can kind of see the rivets. They're kind of exposed and they're kind of obvious. Now, I think they spray painted over the helmets, or maybe they got them that way, but they're really clean, which is fine, but it makes them stand out a little bit more that you can kind of tell that they're not steel pot. And it's, an M1 liner. Nothing crazy. It's probably 50s or 60s variety. Obviously you can't see inside the helmet liner, so you don't know for sure, but it's a guess. And the other major feature on their heads is the Mark IV gas mask, which was a Navy gas mask from the late World War II period, used up until the 50s when it was replaced by the Mark V. This is obviously not accurate to the Army at all, or National Guard for that matter. It's an interesting gas mask, I will say. It's pretty cool looking. It's got the canister in the back. It's pretty unique compared to, other designs. And, at that time, the National Guard would have been probably issued with either the M17 or the M17A1, depending on the unit. So this isn't particularly accurate, but I think it gets the job done. I think it's a cool mask. You see the police SWAT are also wearing the Mark IV. I think it works. It's not the end of the world. All right, so uniform-wise, from what I can tell, majority of them are wearing M65 field jackets. Now, some of them are wearing OG 107 utilities, and I'm not 100% certain on type. You only see some of them briefly. I think some of them are wearing type 3, some are wearing type 2. You can use pattern 1, 2, 3. The type pattern thing, I'm going to do a video on in the future because it's extremely confusing, because it's not actually something used by the military. It's a collector-ism, if you will, but I digress. And from what I can tell, some of them are wearing it underneath the M65, but it's really hard to tell because a lot of them in the film, it's all the way up to their neck. It's closed all the way up, so you can't see what they're wearing underneath. I know later on in the redneck party scene where there are a bunch of guys in the background who are actors they're wearing all sorts of undershirts and stuff, nothing that would really match regulation. So my guess is the guys wearing M65s are only wearing M65s and then just a t-shirt underneath. For the pants or trousers, your guess is probably as good as mine. They could be OG 107 utilities. They could just be a pair of work pants that are green, that look close, that match the color. I can't be sure, but I don't want to say for certain, but that's my guess, is they are OG 107, some sort of surplus OG 107 utility. All right, so the last thing I want to mention with the uniforms before I move on is the unit patch. Now, most of the actors are wearing the unit patch of the 28th Infantry Division, which is correct for the Pennsylvania National Guard. However, they're wearing the unsubdued original red patch. Now, again, like I said, it's the right unit, right patch, just not the right color. And you'll see later with the real National Guardsmen that they were wearing the subdued patch. It's just a nice small detail that they got, and, you know, even if it's not the correct version of the patch, at least it's the correct unit. So, you know, I can't completely fault them for that, but it is what it is. So let's move on. All right, so for gloves, some of the guys are wearing M1949 glove shells. Now, I couldn't get them on the hands, so I apologize, they're not on the mannequin, but some of the guys are wearing these, and there's not much more to say about these gloves. They're just really basic leather gloves. Okay, so for web gear, it's extremely simple. It's just a M1923 cartridge belt. Now, that's really all. If they're wearing any sort of web gear, it's going to be an M1923, with the exception of one guy who I'll flash up a screenshot. I think he's wearing an M1910, maybe an M1917. It's kind of hard to tell because you only see the back, but that's my guess on that. And there's not much more to say about it. It's just a standard M1923 cartridge belt. Now, yeah, of course, by the mid-1970s, late 1970s, these are not going to be used by the National Guard. They're not compatible, really, with the M16 rifle at the time. So it's very not in the right place at the right time type of deal. But it gets the job done. They obviously, it's what they could get their hands on, so they just went with it and made it work. Moving on down to the boots. This is another thing where I can't tell you for sure, or for any certainty, what boots they're wearing. And I'm going to do a boot tangent after I talk about the first mannequin setup for the National Guard, the real National Guard. But you can't see their soles. You don't have any really close-up views of these boots. So I can't make a determination, especially because any point where you actually do see their boots, the fidelity is just not there. It's not high enough depth where I can actually make out any significant detail. So there's a potential chance they're jump boots. They could be McNamara boots. They could be the direct molded sole or ripple sole variety of combat leather boot. But again, your guess is probably as good as mine. So I apologize for not being able to get closer to that, but it is what it is. Okay, so that is what the actors were wearing when portraying soldiers. And as I said, it's pretty simple. Most of the kit is pretty simple. This gives you a general idea. But let's switch on over to the real National Guardsmen and what they were wearing. Okay, so I have Ken here set up to look like the real National Guardsman that you see during the party scene. And we're going to start from the head and work our way down like we did before. Okay, so starting off with the helmet. We have a standard M1 helmet and a Mitchell pattern helmet cover. And this is pretty standard for any unit in the Army at this point in time in the mid to late 1970s. So with the helmets, the only other major thing to talk about would be helmet bands versus no helmet bands. Some of the guys have helmet bands, some of the guys don't. It's probably like 70-30, 65-35. Can't say for sure. I didn't actually go in and do the math. And there is one guy who is wearing M1944 goggles. Now, you can tell that these are M1944 as opposed to Sun, Wind, and Dust goggles, which would have been entering service in that decade, based on the strap. Now, on M1944 goggles, the strap goes through the side instead of over, and on Sun, Wind, and Dust goggles, they go over. So there's one screenshot, I'll throw it up, and you can kind of make that out. It's just a small detail, but I wanted to point it out. And that pretty much wraps it up for the M1 helmet on the actual National Guardsmen. Let's move on over to uniforms. Okay, so talking about the uniforms of the National Guardsmen, the vast majority of them are wearing M65 field jackets. Now, some of them are wearing just their OG 107 or OG 507 utilities, no jacket. And I'm not sure if they're wearing, I can't tell the difference between 107 and 507s just by looking at them. They basically look the same, so there's a potential chance that one of these guys could be wearing 507s. It is after the initial introduction of 507s. So it's a possibility. I'm just throwing it out there so you know. And there is one guy who is wearing an M1951 field jacket instead of the M65, and I'll throw up an image of him, and you can see that, it's got the different color and kind of stands out to me. It's a little interesting. He's only an E5, it appears, so not really sure why he's got an M1951, but I guess that's what he got issued. It's possible maybe he was in back in the day and then, decided to rejoin the National Guard later on, and he just carried that with him, but that's just me guessing at this point, so. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about with the uniforms before we move on to the next item is the unit patch. So I already talked about it with the actors and them wearing the red, unsubdued 28th Infantry Division patch. With the National Guard, they're actually wearing the black, the proper subdued patch that would have been used at that time. Of course, that's what their uniform was. They have it on both their M65s and on their utilities, depending on what they were wearing at that time. Now, I wasn't able to 100% narrow down what unit they were from, but my best guess from looking it up and basing off the bumper of one of the mutts in the scene is they're more than likely from Headquarters and Headquarters Battery of the 1st Battalion, 107th Field Artillery Regiment, 28th Infantry Division. And again, it's a guess, but I feel like it's a pretty good guess. So let's move on to the next thing. All right, moving on to the hands. Once again, M1949 leather gloves. I still can't put them on the mannequin, but there's at least a few guys that you can see wearing these. And I just wanted to make sure I mentioned it and didn't skip over it. So that's it for hands. Okay, so starting off from top to bottom, we have him wearing 1956 suspenders. Now, it feels like it's about 60% M1956 suspenders and about 40% Alice suspenders. So there's kind of a nice mix. This is that transition period, so it kind of makes sense. And working down, we have a LC1, Alice LC1 belt. And we'll also see M1956 belts on them. And some of the guys even have the M1967 belt with the Davis buckle. Now, I have Manny set up with that. I'll talk about that again briefly. Now, spinning them around on the side, they all have the M1967 20-round magazine pouch. Now, this is kind of interesting because obviously by this point, the 30-round magazine would have been, for the most part, the standard issue, but these guys are in a artillery unit, so it's not really as much of a concern for them. And they're also mostly NCOs, so their job probably is not going to be revolving around carrying a rifle and doing grunt stuff. They have other more important stuff to do. All right, moving to the other side, I have a first aid pouch or a compass pouch on the front here. They kind of move around. Some guys have them way over on the side. Some guys have them kind of centered. There's a mix of what is essentially M1967 or Alice and M1956 first aid pouches. So I went with a early Alice, technically M1967. It's a 73 dated one, but anything in that kind of era would be appropriate based on the photos or the video I can, the detail I can get from it. Okay, so moving on over to the canteen cover. There's a mix of canteen covers, including at least one M1956 canteen cover that I've been able to determine. And then I can't tell you if there's any LC1 canteen covers with just a horizontal stitching, no vertical stitching. There's not enough in the movie in terms of angles to get that detail. But in this case, on this setup, I have a M1967 canteen cover. And now this is a 1972 with the metal snaps. They could have plastic snaps. Again, that's a detail that I can't tell from the detail that I have in the movie. It's just not high enough fidelity to get that detail. And that's pretty much the setup for the web gear. It's some combination of those things being put together. I have another setup, again, with Manny that we'll look at in a little bit, but this is just kind of giving you a rough idea of what they're wearing. And that it's very, like I said, very fascinating, the mix of gear at that time. And because these guys are real, National Guardsmen, this is what they were probably issued. And it's just, fascinating to me. Okay, so that almost wraps up this first mannequin setup for the actual National Guardsmen. And we're going to do a real quick boot tangent because I kind of have to go into that. Same thing with the actors. It's really hard to determine what exactly they're wearing, but we'll just jump right over to the table. And then when we come back, we'll look at Manny and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, so on to the boot tangent. Now, the reason why I kind of needed to do this like this was because you never really see the soles of the boots that they're wearing. And without that information, I can't tell if it's a McNair boot or boot combat leather or boot combat leather direct molded sole. And I'm pretty sure they're not the second pattern of the direct molded sole, or commonly referred to as ripple or chevron pattern, because these have a notch about halfway down, and that was to allow a little bit more mobility. Now, those came into service in the mid 70s, so technically before this film was made, but from what I can tell in the film, none of them have the notch. You can kind of make that determination. And so my guess is this is the boot that they're wearing. But there's still a chance that some of the guys that are even older were issued the McNamara boot and are still wearing it. That is a potential possibility. Now, the side tangent to all this is Jungle Boots. And there is two guys that you can see wearing Jungle Boots, both in the scene where you're going past the trucks. Briefly, for a split second, you can see one guy's wearing Jungle Boots. Later on, when they are reacting to zombies behind some of their guys and they go to shoot, you can see the guy on the far left has Jungle Boots on as well. And it makes you think, is this guy a Vietnam vet? And that's why he has Jungle Boots. It just, brings up that question. So the basic point here is that I honestly don't know. And this is the best I can do, is I can tell you that it's probably one of these two pairs of boots. I don't think it's any second patterns visible. And there's two guys minimum that are wearing Jungle Boots. So that's what I got on boots. Now let's get back to one more mannequin to show off kind of the one guy who stands out the most of the National Guardsmen. Okay, so now I have Manny over here. And the reason why I wanted to focus on this specific guy, I'll throw up an image from the movie, is because out of everyone there who was either wearing just plain old utilities or an M65 field jacket, or that one guy wearing the M1951 field jacket, he is wearing an OG 108 wool shirt. And it's not that crazy. It was something that was issued at that time. It was used in lieu of your OG 107 utility top. But it's still kind of a cool thing to see, and kind of stands out amongst the sea of M65. So I wanted to point that out. He also happens to have one of the M1967 belts with the Davis buckle. And he's also wearing Alice suspenders as well. And then basically everything else is pretty much similar to everyone else that is around him. I ended up going with an LC1 canteen cover. My justification for this is that slowing down the video and trying to look at it, it doesn't look like it's got vertical stitching. But I'm not going to lie, it's, again, incredibly hard to tell, even slowing it down and trying to enhance the image. And I just wanted to mix it up a little bit just to show the potential that could be there. And then on the other side, still has a 20-round M1967 mag pouch, and then in this case, I think this is a 1974 dated first aid pouch. So I tried to match this as close as I could. So I went with a more faded pair of OG 107 utility pants. They're a little bit like a brighter green, so it kind of stands out, especially next to the wool shirt. So the only other detail that I wanted to just quickly point out was, and I don't have the pins, but in the movie he has Staff Sergeant pins on his collar and Staff Sergeant pins on his helmet band. The ones on his collar are not subdued and they stand out quite a bit, and then the one on the helmet band is subdued. And that pretty much wraps him up. I wanted to cover him just because he was a little different compared to everyone else. He had the OG 108 wool shirt on, which is kind of a unique piece of kit, and it was just something that, I felt like stood out enough that was important to talk about. And with that, we're almost at the end of this video. I really quickly just want to talk about the vehicles and the one howitzer that you see in the movie, and then we'll wrap this all up. Starting off, we can see that there's at least 3 M151A1 mutts. 2 can be seen driving up the road, and then later they are parked alongside the group of National Guardsmen as they engage a pair of zombies. One more is seen by the zombies that end up getting shot by the guardsmen. Not far behind the mutts in the first scene is a pair of M880 trucks. You can also barely make out one of them parked in front of the M35s. Speaking of the M35 deuce-and-a-half trucks, there's 3 of them. You can see them driving up the hill, and then later they are parked alongside that same road. One of them is towing an M101A1 105mm howitzer. Well, that does it for the vehicles, so let's wrap this up. Okay, so that was Dawn of the Dead, and this is one of my favorite movies of all time. I watched it at way too young of an age, so thanks, Dad, for letting me watch that. But it's had an impact on me, and it's just one of those movies that I can go back and watch at any point and enjoy, and probably find something new that I missed, the 100 other times I've seen the film. And like I said, one of the big things that have always stood out to me is the military surplus. It's such a random mix of gear, and it's very indicative of the time period of the 1970s, mid to late 1970s, with being a National Guard unit, with a heavy mix of both M1967 and Alice gear, mixed a few M1956 gear kind of popping in there. It's just a wonderful display of what that time period was for that gear. And even though the movie, the actors, the gear and equipment and uniforms that they were given isn't exactly the most accurate for the time frame, it doesn't detract from the movie that much, and I can look past it and still enjoy the movie because it's whatever. It's a horror movie. It doesn't need to be that detailed. It's not going for realism. The fact that National Guardsmen were willing to volunteer and be in the movie is a fantastic little thing, and it's something that is kind of a George Romero thing because anyone that lived in that area, I guess, growing up, wanted to be a zombie in one of his films. So being in one of his films was kind of a thing, as far as I've been able to read about. With that being said, though, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something, or you didn't know that was the way it was. And as always, thanks for watching.